I spied on my sister and her boyfriend. It was so much worse than kissing. When I was around 8, I watched my older sister and her boyfriend James. They had an air of secrecy about them. Thinking back to it, James had a strange attractiveness about him. Tall, with lanky arms and pink lips that protruded in an almost perfect oval. My sister, Anne, I suppose objectively, had a flattering figure, a thin nose that ended in a pronounced little button. I crouched behind some car junk, old hubcaps, and the rusted frame of a Toyota. Anne and James were on the opposite side of the little valley, and they walked down to the edge of the stream. There was a great thicket of foliage that kept me from seeing anything below their waists. James trudged behind Anne, who walked briskly. I could hear James speaking to my sister at the water. Thank God we're alone. James looked around to clarify, and I hoped I was truly hidden. The moment I saw you, I realized the reason for my existence. I knew that you were meant to be mine, and I knew that I was meant to be yours. You are my idol, the one that I worship. I am in love with you. I've never been so in love, and I'd never ask for your affection. I am undeserving, unworthy. But if I can please, there was a thud and a great splash in the water. Anne said something to James that I couldn't make out, but he stopped talking. James stumbled and landed a kiss on Anne, an accident. Anne backed away from him and smeared the kiss from her face in overt rejection. I discovered I was sitting in ants and being bitten. I let out a yelp. From there, Anne's demeanor changed. She flew into James's arms and began kissing him passionately. He stood only for a moment and then returned her advances. They fell into each other and down into the foliage out of my sight. There was a poison. The two young lovers kissed and laughed, but the air was rotted. There was something unworldly. A screaming in my mind told me that I wasn't supposed to be there. So, I ran. I got out from behind that rusted truck and I ran, careful to keep my head below the foliage. It didn't matter. Anne heard me, and as an older teenager, her legs could travel quicker than mine. She caught up to me and grabbed me by the arm. I did what kids do and let the full weight of my body drop to the floor. She yanked me up. I could feel her fingers digging into my bicep where I was sure purple bruises would soon grow. She looked at me with malice, her eyes fixed and radiating none of the sisterly love I might expect. "Let me go," I shouted, afraid. "You're a good boy, Sam," Anne said with a glib sweetness. Behind her, I saw James where Anne left him. He was standing and looking at me with what I think now was pity. He stood there and shook his head, begging me not to make any sudden movements. James ran up to Anne and stood behind me to block me from trying an escape. James spoke in a way that felt genuine and desperate. Maybe he didn't like what he'd gotten himself into. As Anne was saying, "You're a good boy. When I was a kid, I used to spy on my older brother and his girlfriend. I know what it's like to be curious at your age." Anne loosened her grip on my arm and I shook it a couple times. "What were you doing?" I asked, hoping for a satisfactory answer to disperse the looming fog of fear. "I think you have an idea of what we were doing. You're old enough," Anne said. "Just don't tell Mom, please, Sam. James is really important to me, and you know exactly how Mom is." Anne rolled her eyes for emphasis. I was relieved, but now I had something on them. It's an obligation of younger siblings to be a bother to their older siblings. "I won't say anything if you give me $1. James took a crumpled dollar bill from his pocket, gave it to me, and shrugged. I ran off. All was okay. My sibling and her boyfriend were young lovers. We shared a secret, and I was $1 richer. The next day, I was sitting on the steps behind the banister while James and Anne were crouched by a set of boxes in the living room. I figured the more secrets I had, the more favors I could get. I wondered how much money I could get from James. "That little shit," Anne sneered. "He's just a kid," James offered. "A kid who's gonna ruin this." She tapped one of the boxes with her hand. I I ran out, down the stairs, and into the living room. Found you. Again. Anne looked at James, and James blushed. Just like last time, he pulled a crumpled dollar out of his pocket and gave it to me. It was all in a day's work, and I ran upstairs to put the dollar bill next to the other one in the drawer where I kept my socks and the old bags of chips I'd snuck upstairs. I tormented the two of them for a month. There were more boxes and more trips to the field. There was a smell about the house, and James fell into a daze. He followed my sister around like a dog, and I hardly noticed. I was having so much getting a rise of them, getting bits of money. I thought it was harmless fun, and I should have noticed all that was wrong. I should have noticed how my mother only came out of her room once in a while, and how when she did, she stared into the distance at absolutely nothing at all. It was September 1st, at around 3 in the morning. There were no boxes in the living room, but a circle of heads. Some I recognized as neighbors. Some I thought I might have seen before, and some were strangers to me. Each had a candle sticking out of their scalp that burned while wax dripped in long strings from their noses. Some of them had a look of concern about them, and some had tongues that lolled from their mouths and bits of saliva that dripped to the floor. I was in my usual spot at the top of the stairs behind the banister. This time I didn't want to jump out to surprise them. Instead, I shook, and tears filled my eyes. It was like that first time in the field, but so much worse than that. Not that strange fear of a child's imagination, but something real. Something that shouldn't be, but was. "Come down, Sam," Anne ordered. James just sat by the circle of heads. I don't think there was much in him at that point. Whatever my sister did to him, she had done it completely. I walked down the stairs. I knew there was no use trying to escape. I stood before her out of breath. I tried to speak, but nothing. Anne shouted again, "Mom, come over here." I heard the creak of our mom's door from the left of where we stood, and the soft sliding of her slippers against the carpet. She had the same dazed look that James sported, the same thing done to her. "All of you, get in the middle of the circle." She shot a glance at each one of us. I'd never seen my sister so happy. There was an unrepentant glee in every word she spoke. There was a bounce in her movements. My mother and my sister's lover walked right into the middle of those horrible heads. Those heads were watching them. "Get in the circle," Anne screeched at me. I just screamed. I screamed as loud as I could and hoped that someone could hear me and save me from this. The house had become lost in a void beyond time and goodness, but maybe I could break through. Maybe there was hope. "Get in the fucking circle," and grabbed me by the arm and dragged me into the circle. The mouth of each head opened then and started a low groan and started to chant. It was some unknown language full of clicks and sounds I think impossible for a human to make. I tried to move but froze instead. "It's happening," Anne shouted. An ant crawled out of my pocket. The tiniest creature would be the one to save our lives. It had a crumb from one of those chip bags upstairs, and it walked down my pant onto my socks and then across the floor. Blissfully unaware of the world of the unknown and the demonic affairs we were trapped in, it walked past the heads, and the heads all at once stopped moaning and fell over. The life came back to James and my mother's eyes. We all pushed back Anne and ran out the door into the neighborhood street. Dawn was soon, and the earlier birds were chirping. Everything was normal again. A few years later, when I was a bit older, I had my own girlfriend. We sat in that field behind the rusted Toyota that stayed unchanged apart from the foliage that was slowly enveloping it. My heart swelled with love. I wanted to tell her exactly how I felt, how I wanted to be with her forever, but instead I just turned and said to her, "Sarah, I'm glad you're here." "I'm glad you're here too." Sarah smiled and kissed me on the lips. My world lit up, and I closed my eyes to savor the emotion. "Watch out for the anthill, by the way," I said as Sarah shifted. Thank you for listening and delving into the dark with me. I would be so grateful if you please click the thumbs up, subscribe, and leave a comment. The more engagement this video gets, the more YouTube will push my content to others, and thus our twisted little community will grow. All stories read on this channel will be available on Spotify, iTunes, iHeartRadio, and many other podcast apps. Links are in the description. Thank you again for listening, and I look forward to hearing from you.